Hello and welcome. My name is Claude Rivard. I am the curator of the Naval Museum of Manitoba, and we are here to celebrate the Centennial of the Naval Reserves in Canada, and also to celebrate the Centennial of the HMCS Chippawa Naval Reserve Unit here in Winnipeg. I would also like to thank those who were instrumental in starting the Naval Museum of Manitoba, namely Commander Chris Thane, who was commanding officer at the time, and Michael Shortridge, whose idea was to start the Naval Museum in Manitoba. Thank you for joining us and helping us celebrate 100 years of service of the Navy in Manitoba.
My name is Paul Stiff. I'm a retired Canadian naval officer, former member of HMCS Chippawa, and very happy to speak about the Naval Reserve on its 100th anniversary. I think it comes as a surprise to an awful lot of people that Canada is a maritime nation. It's a maritime nation that maybe doesn't know it. Now, a maritime nation is a nation that certainly is situated with a coastline on salty water, but it's also a nation that requires free and open access to the ocean, not only for natural resources, but also for the maintenance of trade on the sea lines of communication. And Canada is certainly that. Almost 250 million, 240,000 kilometers of coastline. Canada also has a massive continental shelf, the second largest in the world. Now, a continental shelf is very, very important because that is the area about 200 miles or so off the coasts where all of the natural resources are, including fisheries. So these areas are vastly important, hugely important to a country. So a country with a strategic need for access to an ocean needs a strong navy to be able to protect those interests and project its other interests internationally across the blue water as well. Now, Canada has a unique challenge in that area. A massive geographical landmass, a huge coastline, a huge area of natural resources within the continental shelf, and a small population. Now, a small population brings a couple of problems. Difficulty to raise the necessary resources, both financial and human, to stand up and create a navy, and also perhaps a shortage of folks inland who are inclined to support the huge cost of producing a navy. And that is a problem that faced Canada from the beginning of time and still faces it today, but has been addressed, ameliorated, partly solved by the Naval Reserve, both in the past and the way we see it today. Very interesting history. Canada's been a maritime nation since 1867, but it wasn't until 1910 when the Naval Services Act was passed, the Royal Canadian Navy established, given the royal name in 1911, and it wasn't until 1923, after the First World War, World War I was completed, that there actually was the foundation of a naval reserve per se. Now, during the First World War and pre-First World War, Canada, as a dominion to Great Britain, was under the protection of the Royal Navy. Great Britain and the Royal Navy being a massive maritime superpower, we were protected by them. After the First World War, it became apparent, I think, to everybody concerned that Great Britain could no longer project its sea power that far on both Atlantic and Pacific coasts of Canada, and that Canada needed to sort of do its own thing with regard to protecting its coasts, protecting its maritime interests, and standing up its own navy. In the First World War, Canada had 7 combat ships that did patrol the coasts and did its service, but that was essentially demobilized at the end of the First World War in 1918. In 1923, the genius brainchild of a Canadian admiral, Walter Hose, stood up the idea of a naval reserve. And with that, the establishment of companies and half companies of naval reservists in the major cities across Canada. And the idea was, on one hand, to establish and present a recruiting and training capability for manpower across the country, and also to influence the political thought of the constituency to the idea that we needed a navy. So the presence of a naval company in a city, even inland, was part of the education for Canadian citizens and politicians that we were indeed a maritime nation. A maritime nation needs a strong and capable navy, and the Walter Hose invention of the Naval Reserve was a huge start to the education of the constituency and the physical establishment of naval training and recruiting institutions across Canada. It was very successful. And of course, the real test, came at the start of the Second World War in 1939. About 3,000 people strong, the RCN mobilized, like everyone else did, extremely rapidly in order to meet essentially the U-boat threat and to fight the Battle of the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest war, or the longest battle of the Second World War, essentially lasting the entire duration. And arguably the most important battle of the entire war, because the consequence of failure probably would mean that the war would be lost. The vital lifeline of the North Atlantic sea lines of communication carried war supplies, munitions, fuel, and everyday commodities from North America to Great Britain to allow it to continue to progress the war and ultimately prevail. Places like HMCS Chippawa and Naval Reserve units all the way across the country rapidly mobilized and expanded. Training establishments were set up across the country in other places that very quickly recruited and trained not professional mariners, but everyday farm boys, store clerks, librarians, and people from essentially every walk of life, very quickly trained and very quickly sent to sea in a Navy that was building itself in dozens of shipyards that almost instantly sprang up across the country. In the background here, you can see Bedford Basin. Bedford Basin in Nova Scotia became this an important jumping off point for the convoys across North America to Britain. And those convoys were escorted by ships of the Royal Canadian Navy, manned almost exclusively by your everyday sailor who 6 months prior had been minding his own business as a store clerk or a farm boy or whatever. So the establishment of a Navy, the rapid expansion, the amazing feat of training individuals and converting them into naval warriors, if you will, across the country was quite simply astounding. So the Second World War was perhaps the finest hour of the Naval Reserve, and I think it deserves some thought and recollection. The Navy expanded from essentially a tiny force of a couple of thousand individuals and a dozen or so ships to, at the end of the war, the third largest standing Navy, with about 400 ships and about 100,000 men and women. And certainly the introduction of women into the organization was a function of the necessity that the war brought out as well. So, and not without loss. About 20 Canadian warships lost in the Second World War, and about 2,000 sailors. Not to mention the merchant sailors, but focusing on the Naval Reserve aspect of it here. And as it pretty well always happens at the end of the Second World War, at the end of this massive global conflict, the RCN, like all the forces, essentially demobilized and shrunk to peacetime establishments. It was still a very strong and capable Navy, but much less than it had been necessarily been during the wartime. And it was in that period that the Navy established the ability to operate aircraft carriers, to operate helicopters off ships, and to make a lot of technical advancements that essentially brought us into the latter part of the 20th century. So the end of the Second World War, everyone looking forward to a period of peace and quietness, wasn't to be with the establishment, or I should say with the commencement of hostilities in Korea. Again, the Navy responded, and the Naval Reserve was part of that operation as well. So the RCN has a distinguished record in the Korean conflict, and another one that I think from a historical perspective should really be considered. Of course, Korea in the 50s marked the beginning of the Cold War. And so when we look at that period of time, the Naval Reserve, like many organizations do, was focused on a bit of a strategic idea of fighting the next war based on the experiences of the last one. So there was a big focus on the Naval Reserve with regard to naval control of shipping and the organization of convoys. The idea that if the Cold War was to turn into a hot war, then the same idea of reinforcing Fortress Europe would be required. We would need another huge navy. We would need another system of convoys to carry material and armies essentially across the pond again. Well, as it turned out, that hasn't occurred, and hopefully never will. And the idea of naval control of shipping and convoy management essentially eased out. The Naval Reserve might have lost a bit of relevance and importance in that sort of 1970s and later period, but was revitalized with the concept of total force in the 90s. The 1990s saw the advancement of the total force concept. It saw the introduction of the maritime coastal defense vessels, which, smaller and less expensive to operate than the fleet's main combatants of frigates, were and manned primarily by naval reservists, were used for all sorts of general purpose naval duties, sovereignty patrols, etc. Initially designed as mine countermeasures, coastal defense type work, they did all sorts of things and continue to do so today. Another aspect of Canada, I started off talking about a maritime nation, is concern for the Arctic. The Arctic is a critical subject that must be considered as well. There are 5 countries now that are claiming sovereignty over huge chunks of the Arctic. One of them happens to be Canada, and 2 of them happen to be the world's superpowers at the moment. So it's an area that needs to be addressed. There is strategic value and concern over the Arctic. There is massive natural resource exploitation potential there. And at the beginning, we talked about a maritime nation's need to be able to exploit those offshore resources and to be able to protect the interests and protect that exploitation effort as well. There's also a growing communications and sea transport potential there. The Arctic is going to be an open passageway, like the Great Horn and the Panama and Suez Canal are today. Ships will be transiting the Arctic archipelago in a few short years, and there's really no doubt about that. Evidently, I'm not the first person to notice this, because Canada has been working very hard with the advancement of the Arctic Offshore Patrol Vessel, and those ships are being staffed, crewed, and supported by naval reservists as well. So it's a long and very successful story in my view, when we look at a historical aspect of a naval reserve starting with very humble beginnings in the pre-First World War days to seeing us now from being formally established in 1923 to 100 years later, still embracing the total force concept and still contributing as a viable element of Canada's maritime defense. And as we reflect and celebrate the 100th birthday, the centenary, if you will, of the Canadian Naval Reserve, it might be mindful or thoughtful or advantageous to reflect on the lessons learned, the service of those who went before us, and to apply some of those principles going forward into the future. Thank you.
Well, first off, I'd like to congratulate HMCS Chippawa on their 100th anniversary coming up on March the 19th of 2023. So, other than that, I first got involved with Navy life back when the World War II started up in September 1939. As I say, I was 14 years of age at the time, and the day after the war was declared, I walked down Portage Avenue, and a senior from World War I stopped me and said about the war, and he said, "Would you join up?" I said, "If it's still on and I'm old enough, I will." So he says, what outfit would you go in? I said, "There's a lot of room up there." So I said, "I'm thinking of the Air Force." So he says, "Oh, that's nice." So the next day, I was walking down Ellis Avenue, coming up to Sherbrooke, where the Naval Barracks was at that time, and the Sea Cadets were parading, John Travers, Cornwall, BC. So I went in to see what it was all about. And since that day, I've never looked back. Because when I was 18, I joined the Navy, and I've been involved with it for some time. After our basic training here, they sent us down east for more, and I picked up a yacht, HMCS Husky. They called it an armed yacht because it had a little 3-pounder on the bar, on the bow, and I don't know what would have happened if we'd run into the Bismarck, but we were happy that nothing happened. And from there, I went back to Stadacona, and I got shipped to HMCS Niobe, the barracks outside of Glasgow in Scotland. And from there, we went to Camp Rothmar on the banks of the Clyde. And from there, I eventually ended up commissioning HMCS Loch Ackinold. Well, we joined EG6, Escort Group 6 in Londonderry, and we operated in the Channel, the English Channel, and then we operated up north in the North Atlantic there, between the Faroe Islands and Norway. I was the quartermaster steering the ship, and the first day on the wheel, or the day after I'd been on the wheel, they told me to steer by ASDIC. You know what ASDIC is? Sonar, yeah. Well, it was called ASDIC back then during the war. So I was waiting for a radar training. But this first day on the wheel, up there, and all of a sudden the word came down from the bridge, steer by ASDIC. So I'm trying to steer by ASDIC, and the ship wouldn't respond. So the officer called down and he said, "Where are you going?" I said, "The ship is not responding, sir." Because apparently when you steer by ASDIC, you have to do opposite wheel than if you're steering by well, steering by compass. So I was going the wrong way. So anyhow, I brought her back, but it wasn't a sub anyhow, so I didn't feel too bad. Yeah. And on the day of the October 16th, 1944, we were busy dropping squid, depth charges, and all that. Of course, that was getting to be a daily routine at any rate, but we couldn't hit anything, apparently. So we just carried on, and that night, the German submarine came to the surface. And we had a running surface gunfight with them. They eventually were sunk, and we picked up 28 survivors. And some of the ships in the group picked up the rest. And we kept them on board for, I think, for a week, because we had to finish our patrol. And then we took them back into Scotland and dropped them off, and the British Army boys took them to the prisoner of war camp. And then after that, we gone through a storm and had opened up some of the plates on the ship. So they sent us to Holyhead, North Wales, for a refit. So while we're there, I'm walking down the street with a buddy, and I saw a sign to Llangefni. So I said to the policeman that was there, I said, how do I get to the bus? How do we get the bus to Llangefni? He said, you're Canadian. I said, yeah. He says, now there's a war on. I said, I think I'm familiar with that. So he says, why do you want to go there? I said, my aunt lives just outside of Llangefni in Telwyn. Oh, so that changed the whole situation. And he told me where I could go to get a bus that took me to Llangefni. And I got there, and I had to walk 4 miles to Telwyn. So I walk in, knock on my aunt's door. And she came and she said, you must be Bobby Watkins. I said, yes, Andy, I am. And she said, your brother did the same thing to me when he called here. She was cleaning the hearth, so she was all covered with soot. So anyhow, I went back to the ship and I requested Christmas leave. I had Christmas leave with my aunt. Yeah, so that was good. And I'd go and visit her when I could. And I got pretty friendly with the postal guy. So he and I would walk from Telwyn to Llangefni, the 4 miles at night just to have a beer. And then on the way home, we would order 2 quarts of beer and walk the 4 miles back. And, you get thirsty walking 4 miles. So I was lucky. Wherever I went, I had somebody to visit or a relative. So I went from Wales, Scotland, England, Ireland, because our home port was Londonderry. Yeah, I had somebody everywhere I went. Then I came home when the war finished. I started for the Winnipeg Electric Company, the transit. And then in 1949, I rejoined the reserves in the Navy. And I stayed into 1959. And during that time, I was also helping the Navy League of Canada with their cadet course. So I was doing that, and then I got onto the board of the National Board of the Navy League. And I ended up as the vice president of the board after 10 years. And then I came back to Winnipeg. Well, I was in Winnipeg, but I came back to Chippawa and said, that's it. I said, I won't sign on for another 5 years. But so that's about the story of my life. Chippewa was very good to me. I've stayed out of trouble. As you know, Chippewa, the reserve started in 1923. I was born in 1925. So I'm 2 years younger than the ship. Yep. So maybe that was the start of my life, I don't know. But I've had a good one with the Navy. I've enjoyed it. So I wish them well, and I wish you guys well. I'm quite willing, and I'm very proud to say to HMCS Chippewa, you're celebrating 100 years, and I wish you well, and keep up the good work. Thank you.
Hi, good day. I'm Andre Shepard, Petty Officer First Class retired. I did 36 years in the Royal Canadian Navy, Regular Force and Reserve. My occupation and where I served, just to give some more insight, I started out on the East Coast. I did a couple of years on the East Coast, and then I did some training on the West Coast and realized that I'm better off being a sandy bottom sailor. So I got transferred to the West Coast. I sailed on the West Coast primarily. I been around the world. The only places I haven't been to is Australia and Russia. I've been through both canals, did peacekeeping in the Red Sea, pirate patrols in the Indian Ocean, did RIMPAC exercise on the West Coast, did NATO on the East Coast. So I've had quite the career. Later on in my career, I got posted inland to Winnipeg, and I was working at Area Cadets, and this is where I retired and ended up joining the Sea Cadets. I was a commanding officer of the Sea Cadet Corps in Brandon. Then I got a position with Chippewa as a recruiter, and I did 7 years with Chippewa as a recruiter and then retired in 2015. What I wanted to talk about today was some history that I didn't find out about until I joined Chippewa. Now, I'm going to talk about Percy Haynes. Percy Haynes, born in British Guyana. Family immigrated to Winnipeg in about 1911. While in Winnipeg, Percy Haynes was very big into sports, music. He played basketball, baseball, boxing. He also did some coaching. Percy Haynes, later on during World War II, him and some friends decided that they were going to join the Navy. So they went down to Chippewa, which at that time was the recruiting center. His friends were able to join, but he was told that no black men were not allowed to join the Royal Canadian Navy. And they said they felt it wasn't safe to have a black man on a ship with all white sailors. So that was part of the reason why he wasn't allowed to join. So Percy Haynes, being the man that he was, decided that wasn't good enough. So he started a letter writing campaign, and it made it all the way up to the Admiral of the Navy. And then they decided that they were going to change the rules, and he was allowed to join. So Percy Haynes joined the Navy at Chippewa as a shipwright. So during his time in Chippewa as a shipwright, he also displayed his music talent, and he is very big with jazz. He met his wife, and they opened up a restaurant, which was very famous in Winnipeg as the Chicken Shack. And at that time, all the musicians that came to Winnipeg, Duke Ellington and all the big musicians of the day, would end up at the Chicken Shack after hours, and they'd have their big jamboree going on at the Chicken Shack. So Percy Haynes, being the first black man to join the Royal Canadian Navy, ended up being one of my heroes once I found out about him. So before him, and people get a little bit confused, was William Hall. And William Hall was the first black man to receive the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award. But he got that, he left Truro, Nova Scotia, and joined the Royal Navy and sailed with the British during the Indian Rebellion. And so he was the first black man from Canada to join the Royal Navy, and Percy Haynes was the first one to join the Royal Canadian Navy. So black sailors in the Royal Canadian Navy, there is a display wall in National Defense Headquarters which has over 300 years of Canadian black history in the military. And on that wall, it goes from Matthew de Costa, first free black man to come to Canada, with Samuel de Champlain as an interpreter, carries on up to William Hall, number 2 Construction Battalion, first all-black battalion during World War I, because blacks weren't allowed to fight with the white soldiers, so they formed a construction battalion for them. So they didn't get weapons, they got shovels instead, and went overseas to build roads, bridges, and worked with the forestry department in France. And then it carried on up through the years to War of 1812, was also on the wall for Richard Pierrepoint, which was a slave that came to Canada to be a free man, and then went back and fought with the British during the War of 1812. Carrying on up to the first black coxswain of Naval Reserve Unit HMCS HMCS Scotian, which is Perry Cawley. The first black coxswain on a warship was on the HMCS Annapolis. Then it also talks about then it sort of ends there, and they haven't updated it. My picture is on the wall, and my picture is there because my mother was contacted about getting information about me, so she sent a picture and all kinds of write-up. And then when I was on Facebook one day, a friend of mine put on a post on Facebook saying, "I saw your picture on the wall, well done." And I got a hold of him and said, "What wall?" So then I found out about this wall and that I was on it. And then it sort of just drops off from there. We also had our first black commanding officer of a minor war vessel, Lieutenant Commander Smith from Toronto. I believe it's HMCS York. You also had here in Chippawa, so I've been able to come across the first black lieutenant commander in the Naval Reserves, was George Atwell. And he ended up passing away. Chippawa, being the great unit that it is, they made up his own ship's crest that they presented to him and the family as a gesture for his time when he was with Chippawa. The significance of the 100th anniversary of the Centennial of the Naval Reserves. For someone like me, I started my career in Navy League cadets, went from there to Sea Cadets, from Sea Cadets to the Reserves, to the regular force, back to the Reserves with cadets, and then back to the Naval Reserves at Chippawa. So my whole life has been the Navy, Naval Reserves. So this 100th anniversary is a big deal to me because it gets me. I get a chance to show off to the neighborhood, hey, I was a part of this, and it's a great organization to be a part of. I had a fantastic career. There's no complaints about my whole time in the Navy, and the people that I've met. I have a friend that I met when I was a Naval Cadet at 9 years old. We ended up going different ways. I went Navy, he went Army. We left Nova Scotia, and we ran into each other as adults in Victoria, with him being a 3 PPCLI. He ended up getting posted to Winnipeg. 2 years after that, I got posted to Winnipeg. So we managed to stay together, and now with me working for the Commissioneers. He is also working for Commissioneers, so we get to see each other every day. So the people you meet, it's just fantastic. There was an old commanding officer at Chippawa, was Lieutenant Commander Heather Huthorst, who is now Lieutenant Colonel Collins, her and I joined the reserves together at Scotian when we were 17 as an ordinary seaman going through the summer training program. So, I mean, she's here in Winnipeg, and just the people you meet and you start your career, you run into them again later on in your career, and the friendships that you make. So I get to show this off with the 100th anniversary, and everyone I talk to, I'll be promoting this and make sure everyone in Winnipeg and all my friends around the world know this event and keep an eye out for it. So being a board member with the Naval Museum of Manitoba, I get to learn more history about the Navy, about the hardships that sailors went through, about the good times and the bad times, and the customs and traditions. And this 100th anniversary, we get to reach out to the community and pass on some of this knowledge about customs and traditions. And then with myself, I am also a member of the Black History Manitoba Celebration Committee, and I get to pass on this naval history, blacks in the Canadian Armed Forces, blacks that served in the Navy. I get to pass this on to that community as well, and we reach into the schools and we pass on that history. And this year I'll be able to incorporate the black history with the naval history as well. So in my closing remarks, I just want to say that as I have on my shirt today, Naval Veteran, I am so proud of being in the Canadian Navy. As I say, 36 years. I had a fantastic time. My last posting being Chippawa, and I will always remember Chippawa for the opportunities that I was afforded with being here, the history that I learned while I was in Chippawa, and given me the opportunity to pass that on to the community. So this 100th anniversary, I wish everyone the best, and I look forward to running into some old friends during this time and rekindling some friendships, telling some more stories, and sitting at the Liars table at the Legion and at the Army, Navy, Air Force veterans, and listening to the stories that the old sailors there have to tell. But thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Hi, I'm Patricia Young. I was a Wren and I joined in 1958, and now I'm a volunteer and on the board of directors with the Naval Museum of Manitoba, and have served with the Naval Museum for 22 and a half years. On January 26, 1950, and as an act of Parliament, the Women's Royal Canadian Naval Service Reserves was formed. In 1951, there were 60 officers and 650 Wrens that joined to serve in the Navy in Canada. The Wrens were totally integrated and reorganized in 1950. By 1951, and at the end of the year, there were 35 Wrens here at HMCS Chippawa, organized by Lieutenant Joan Brackenridge. The Wrens were limited in the trades at that time, and they marched in their own divisions, separate from the men. In 1967, and with the unification of the armed forces, trades opened up to Wrens. They ended up marching with the men in divisions. All trades are open to women in the service today. I'd like to now read an excerpt from a speech by Lieutenant Commander Edith Williams, who was our Wren divisional officer at the time. The Wrens had a feeling of satisfaction from the knowledge of contributing towards their country as members of a service rich in tradition. We as ex-Wrens still maintain a sense of pride, having been in the Navy during these years. which will have a lasting effect and influence on the lives of all of us who live through them. The Wrens in those early years laid the foundation for what continues to be the finest female naval forces today. In 1950, during the flood here in Winnipeg, approximately 150 ex-Wrens volunteered to keep the canteen open, serve meals and coffee to the military who were called to assist in building dikes and pumping water. You know, in 1950, during the polio epidemic, there was a shortage of nurses in the hospital. The 2 Navy nurses here at Chippawa stepped up and joined the hospital to look after polio patients. In 1956, the complement of Wrens here at HMCS Chippawa was 72 Wrens, which doubled those of 1951. In 1970, the Wrens went to sea and trained with the men on the gate vessels. In 1973, the Naval Reserve Summer Student Training Program opened up to females. When I went on training in the communications trade to HMCS Star in Hamilton, Ontario, our Wren Lieutenant Tate, who was with NDHQ there, had us go on board the HMCS Outremont, which of course at that time Wrens didn't serve on ships. We had to go to the ship in our uniforms, and we carried a suitcase with our civvies. And we joined the families of the servicemen on board, and of course the Chief Petty Officer in charge took charge of the 6 of us Wrens. And we sailed from Hamilton to the Yacht Club in Toronto. And then the sailors put the nets down, and we climbed down with our suitcases on board the Navy cutter and was taken to the Yacht Club. And there we changed into our civvy clothes and we toured Toronto, and then we boarded a bus and went back to Hamilton to the Naval Reserve. That was a big thing in those days. I'd like to show you a little bit of our display of the Wrens. The diorama around the back of the display are Wrens, officers and Wrens that served during the World War II and post-war. Also in here we have a display of our Wren Divisional Officer, Lieutenant Commander Edith Williams, and her medals. Oh, and yeah, the last thing is, this is me when I was 19 years old. That was taken in 1959 when I went to HMCS Cornwallis for my basic training. It was very interesting. Some of the Wrens that I served with, I have as friends today, almost 50 years later. In closing, I'd like to say that it was an honor for me to serve my country as a Wren in those early days, and also volunteering here at the Naval Museum and on the board of directors, I feel is an honor. And preserving here in the museum the history of the women in the Navy.
I'm Lieutenant Commander Colin Stewart, former Commanding Officer of HMCS Chippawa. I'm here today in the Naval Museum of Manitoba to tell you about a piece of naval history and art that many people don't know about. and that's gun shield graffiti. Much like nose art on fighter and bomber aircraft of World War II, nose art allowed a crew to express their individuality, and in the case of ships, come up with a visual representation of that ship's name. Now, given that it was World War II, Bugs Bunny and Donald Duck and other Disney characters were very popular, and so most gun shield graffiti involved that. But in some cases, it involved just things that were plays on words of the ship's name. Now, as far as we're aware, there's only one piece of gun shield graffiti left after the war, and that's the one behind me, which is the second set of gun shield graffiti from HMCS Snowberry. HMCS Snowberry was a Flower-class corvette originally ordered for the Royal Navy, but turned over to the Royal Canadian Navy. During the war, advances in anti-submarine technology resulted in the development of the Hedgehog, an anti-submarine mortar that threw depth charges in front of the ship, instead of them being dropped off the back. Because of the size of Flower-class corvettes, a full Hedgehog system couldn't be mounted on the ship. The solution was to mount rockets on the side of the gun, allowing them to still have that capability. But that meant that the gun shield graffiti had to go. Ever resourceful ship's crews solved that problem through the use of paint and some plywood. By simply painting new gun shield graffiti on a sheet of plywood with brackets mounted, they were able to, when they were in port, hang the gun shield graffiti, thereby identifying their ship, and when they went to sea, to stow it somewhere safe. Now, at the end of the war, most ships were broken up and the gun shield graffiti was lost. This particular piece, the one behind me, was saved by leading seaman Sandy Thompson, a sonar operator on HMCS Snowberry, and a resident of Winnipeg at the time. At the end of the war, Sandy decided, so the story goes, that he wanted the gun shield graffiti to be preserved. So Sandy apparently tucked it under his arm, walked off the ship, and walked down the jetty with a sense of purpose, and no one challenged him. And that's how the Naval Museum of Manitoba came to be in possession of the last piece of gun shield graffiti.
Good afternoon. I'm Bill Shedd. I'm a former member of HMCS Chippawa. I served in the regular force and also in the reserve force, and I was a member of the ship's company of HMCS Chippawa. This year we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Royal Canadian Naval Reserve, and perhaps I have a story or two that might interest people about our Navy, particularly our Naval Reserve. I don't think many people realize how many volunteers served in the Royal Canadian Navy who are what we call RCNVR, Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve. Fully 90% of all people who served the Second World War in the Canadian Navy were RCNVR. Many of them went on to careers in the Royal Canadian Navy, regular force, after the war. One very notable person had a very strong connection here with HMCS Chippawa, and that was Rear Admiral Jeffrey Vanstone Brock. Besides the war activities, out of the war came a program called the University Naval Training Division. Now this program was nicknamed Untidies, and it produced reserve officers who went to university and served in the reserves, and they developed officers from this program. Many of them went on to serve in the Royal Canadian Navy regular force afterwards and had very distinguished careers. It was a very, very productive naval officer development program. The Naval Reserves are more than what we do nationally in the two programs I just mentioned, the RCNVR during the World War II and the UNTD program. In HMCS Chippawa particularly, we had some very distinguished service during such things as the 1950 flood, when an awful lot of members of HMCS Chippawa manned ducks to go out and do some flood work during that great Winnipeg flood of 1950. As well, in the old building, they had a swimming pool, and that became a huge hydrotherapy pool for polio victims, and this was in the early 50s. After that, when we moved into this new building, we were involved in a number of what I call commemorative events. First, we had a commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the Royal Canadian Navy. And we had a weekend-long ceremony or activities to commemorate the 75th. One of the first things that we did was we convinced the city of Winnipeg to name or rename the stretch of Smith Street directly in front of Chippawa into Navy Way. The other thing that we did that was quite unique in this facility, the Naval Museum of Manitoba, we asked the people who were attending or who would like to bring their rabbits. Those are the souvenirs that they took away from their service, either in the Royal Canadian Navy or in the reserves. Some of them were binnacles, some of them were shell casings, a whole bunch of memorabilia that formed the basis for this museum. A very, very nice museum that has history preserved. And if it wasn't for Chippawa and the 75th anniversary, I don't think this museum would have existed as it is today. It might still come, might still have developed, but I think it would have been much later. Well, before we forget about the 75th anniversary, I should mention that the guest of honor for that particular event was Rear Admiral Jeffrey Van Stonebrock. As I mentioned, he was a member of the ship's company of HMCS Chippawa just at the beginning of World War II, and he went on to a very distinguished career fighting submarines, for which he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He then continued on to serve in Korea, where he was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for an action in that battle. He went on to become the Flag Officer Atlantic and eventually retired from the Navy and wrote 2 very good books about his career, and he was our guest of honor for that anniversary. A very wonderful chance to meet somebody who really contributes so much to our Navy and to the Battle of the Atlantic in Korea. Well, when you come into the new building, you see 2 things that really are interesting. First, you see the Prairie Sailor. That is a great project to commemorate those who served in the Royal Canadian Naval Reserve from our part of the territory. I have a great fondness for the commemorative action, for commemoration ceremonies. When I served as the Regional Director General for Veterans Affairs, that was really one important part of our mandate as the department. And we can't do the commemoration without the action of people like HMCS Chippawa, who not only build monuments like the Prairie Sailor, but they host annual events for Remembrance Day, for the Battle of Atlantic Sunday, and these are very, very important events which are open to the public, and that really projects the contribution that Canadians have made in the important Battle of the Atlantic during World War II, and all of the things they continue to do in emergency services. I have a personal pride in my service in the Navy, and more than that, I have a personal pride in the members of my family who served in the RCN during the Second World War. They were all reservists, all members of Chippawa. They include my dad and his 2 brothers. One of their cousins was a member of the ship's company of HMCS St. Croix that was sunk in September 1943 in an action with a U-boat. It was a very tragic incident when the ship was torpedoed. There were survivors. They were picked up by a Royal Navy destroyer, but that ship was sunk with all hands the next day, and there were only 2 survivors, 1 Canadian and 1 Brit. Very sad, and it was a member of our family that was lost, plus 146 others. My dad and his 2 brothers were really motor mechanics, artificers, and they had another cousin. Surprisingly enough, two of them, my dad and his cousin, were both named Harry, and their mail got mixed up. My dad would get Uncle Harry's mail, and Uncle Harry would get Dad's mail. What a crazy life we live in. There were other people who served from the family in other forces, the Air Force and the Army. At one time I checked it out, and I think we have about 100 years of service. Now, my personal contact in the reserves stems back to my time in the regular force when I was the resident staff officer for the University of Toronto, and I was attached to HMCS York, a reserve division in Toronto. I also got involved in training UNTD cadets in the summertime as a term lieutenant or a training officer. When I left the regular force and moved back to Manitoba and pursued a civilian career, I rejoined the reserves almost immediately. I left the regular force in April, and I joined Chippawa in October, and I served for, I think it was 15 years, I can't remember which. Time goes by so fast, you don't know whether it's 10 years or 15 years. Probably somewhere in between. My primary task here was to be the commanding officer on gate vessel weekends. During my naval career in the regular force, I did become command qualified, and I did drive a burr boat one summer, HMCS Loon. I think it was 1966. But when I was with the reserves, I did an awful lot of gate vessel weekends, not just for Chippawa, but for a number of other reserve divisions, particularly in the prairies, Queen and Nonsuch, Tecumseh. And then in the summertime, I also commanded gate vessels on summer training, particularly on the West Coast, on the East Coast. So I think that I've commanded every gate vessel as a Naval Reserve officer on the Atlantic, on the Pacific, and on the Great Lakes. It was a marvelous and an interesting career, and all the guys that I trained with and served with in Chippawa were just first class. They were just marvelous shipmates. And many of them went on to serve at sea as well in the regular force. But the ones that stayed in the reserves, they were very, very committed to the reserves, particularly to Chippawa. There's an awful lot of fellows who have had long service in this unit, and they should be very proud of it. Well, as you know, we have an awful lot of ships that bear indigenous names: Sioux, Chippewa, all the tribal class destroyers, Algonquin, Iroquois. They all bore indigenous names, First Nations names. Well, they're not even, they're tribal names more than anything else. In this country, we do have an issue with indigenous people that does have a history that's not very pleasant. In the Canadian Navy, we did have an awful lot of individuals who did serve, indigenous people who did serve in the Navy. I give you the example of my dad and his two brothers. Their mother was a member of the Fisher Branch First Nation, and they served as chief motor mechanics and engine room artificer. So we did have them serving. In my time, I've served with a number of indigenous other ranks, as you would call them. It took me a while to find one other indigenous officer in the Navy. I think I may have been amongst the few that had been from about 1960 to about 1980. One of the things that I got involved in personally was I told the story when I was at the University of Toronto, and there was a conference on Indigenous people at Trinity College, which was about half a kilometer from my office. And I walked over late one morning to see what the conference was all about. And I was sitting at the back of the audience in my uniform, and the fellow next to me turned to me and he said, he says, I was in the Navy. And we got to introduce each other. It turned out that he was a Delaware from Six Nations, and his name was Russ Moses. Now, Russ and I became instant friends. It led to me being seconded from the Navy to the Public Service Commission to develop what they call a cabinet document on Native employment. That's what they said in those days, Native, not Indigenous, not Aboriginal, in the Public Service of Canada. And as well, I also was charged with the responsibility of expanding the operations of the Public Service Commission to recruit Indigenous people into the public service. So I did that for 2 years. But again, here is the Navy taking a hand in looking at the interior of the government operations by lending them my services over to see what can be done. From that, a number of other things have happened largely long after I left the regular force and even the reserve force, because now you have a pretty interesting bureaucracy of people who have a primary responsibility of giving some Indigenous flavor to our Navy. I think that we have a long way to go, but at least we're making progress. I had a very good career as a reserve officer. I did what I enjoyed with people that I enjoyed being with, and you can't have any more than that to say.
My name's Jerry Dawson, Lieutenant Commander, retired. I'm a former CO of HMCS Chippawa from 1996 to 2000. My first 4 years of command were extremely challenging, but at the same time they were productive and very, very rewarding. The first challenge we had was we had a command team conference held here at Chippawa in November of 1996. All the command teams from the NRDs from across Canada joined us here, plus members of NAVRES HQ. And everything went well until the Sunday afternoon when we were hit with a blizzard. Now you've got 90 people that you have to get back to work on Monday morning. So the logistics nightmare of that particular snowstorm were immense. But the reason I mentioned that snowstorm was that in February or March of 1997, another huge blizzard occurred at the headwaters of the Red River, and they spread up through the Dakotas into southern Manitoba. So by the time we got to March 25th, and things were melting rapidly, we had what was called the flood of the century. Now, we were informed by a warning order that we were to prepare for this flood. It was going to be worse than it was in 1950, even though we had Duff's Ditch by then. The warning order went out. By Monday or Tuesday, we had 2 operational centers set up, one in Chippawa, one at 17 Wing. MOG 4, Maritime Operational Group from Victoria, was called in to help. They were going out to 17 Wing, and 175 naval reservists from across Canada We have 24 units. They came, I think they were all here by Monday or Tuesday. They were all housed in the cadet quarters. They were fed by our personnel, and it was quite something to see. When the reservists came, they brought with them their trucks, which were brand new, trailers, the ribs, which are rigid hull inflatable boats, Zodiacs, and we'd put them all on the main drill deck, which we then used as a boat shed and a mechanic's shop. Everything that we operated on during the flood ran off the main deck. During the operation, we were visited by Admiral Garnett out of Ottawa, and he observed the boat operations as we were rescuing people. We were delivering sand bags to places like Grand Point, where the water was up to the eaves troughs on some houses. And he said he had never seen, or rarely had seen, such good boat work by especially reservists. And he was very impressed. Chippewa's divers, who are familiar with ice diving, were sent to the Zed Dike in Brunkhild to reinforce the dike, which was giving way. If that dike had given way, then the Seine River would have attacked Winnipeg from the west, and the whole city would have flooded the way it had in 1950. As a result of their excellent operations, I think it was about a dozen maritime component commander commendations were given to various naval reservists, and Chippewa received the Deputy Chief of Defense Staff commendation for its handling of the whole operation for the Naval Reserve. After the flood, the Naval Board was looking at the facility of Chippewa, which had been originally the Winter Club of Winnipeg, and decided that it was structurally starting to show its wear and tear. So they started searching for new sites for a new Chippewa. In the meantime, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the Naval Reserve, and then we were told to pack up everything that was in the old Chippewa, and take it out to 17 Wing, where we would be established for at least 1 or 2 years in Building 11, while the old building was destroyed, and then they finally decided to rebuild the new Chippewa on the same site. In the summer of '98, Winnipeg hosted the Pan Am Games, and Chippewa was called upon to supply security to the regatta in Gimli with our rib boats again. I think there were 4 in total. And it was during the regatta that one of the crews was able to save the lives of some civilians whose boat sank on Lake Winnipeg. For that, they got the land component commander's commendation for their tremendous work. All in all, Chippewa supplied security and supervision for 17 venues throughout the games. In 2000, like a stone phoenix, the new Chippewa rose out of the rubble of the old building on the same site. We had a brand new revamped museum. The band still accompanied us in a new band room, and we celebrated a new modern Chippewa that would face the challenges of the 21st century. I relinquished my command in October of 2000 with some regrets, but at the end of the day, I have great pride in what the ship's company accomplished during my 4 years of command. And now I look back and I celebrated the 75th anniversary. I joined at the 50th anniversary. I took the ship through the millennium, and now here we are with the 100th anniversary of HMCS Chippawa.
Good afternoon. I'm Lieutenant Commander Colin Stewart here at HMCS Chippawa in front of one of the unit's larger artifacts, the twin 4-inch quick-firing high-angle gun. So this gun was, we believe, manufactured in 1944 and fitted to either a frigate or an armed merchant cruiser at the end of World War II. It came to the unit for use in training in the early 1950s. So let's take a walk around it and learn a bit more about it. Made all of steel, the gun itself weighs 18.6 tons and can fire 35-pound projectiles. Originally developed with fire control systems, it required manually setting the fuses when first developed. So you would have to estimate how far away is your target, set the fuse, and then fire and hope that things didn't change too much. Eventually, proximity fuses rendered the need for fuse setters obsolete, and so they weren't required. This particular gun, as you can see, is rather large. So when the new building was constructed, this gun was actually placed in its current location prior to the construction of this part of the building. And then they just built this part of the building around it, because obviously it's very hard to drop this in with a crane through the roof. Now, this gun, when it came to the ship, had been sandblasted down by our support base and it was repainted in the state you see it now. However, a lot of the equipment, such as the wiring and the telescopes, were missing. However, over a 2-year period, volunteers with the Naval Museum of Manitoba, 2 World War II veterans by the name of Harold Hughes and Bert Jolly, both who have unfortunately passed away now, restored the majority of the systems on this gun. So they rewired all the systems, they hand-machined new scopes, and so this gun is essentially in full working condition. As we walk around the gun, now, when these were fitted to modern Canadian ships, modern for the late 40s and early 1950s, they had automatic motorized controls. So that these 18 tons of gun, if you had to turn it to a different target, you could do that using electric controls. However, this gun still has all the manual controls, and it sits on bearings here at the ship. If we wanted to, we could in fact rotate the gun around. Obviously, we don't, and the rather shiny chains and locks holding it in place are to prevent that happening by accident. So obviously things have changed, weaponry has advanced, but in addition to being a valuable training piece for numbers of years, this is also an important connection for those of us here at Chippawa in our Centennial year to our past, particularly given the work done by World War II veterans as volunteers at the museum restoring the gun to its current condition. This twin 4-inch gun, as I mentioned, is a high-angle mounting, and so could be used against aircraft. So the barrels themselves could go all the way up to 80 degrees, so almost directly straight up. At its optimum angle for range, this gun mount would have a range of just under 18 kilometers. So that essentially means that here at HMCS Chippawa, standing a stone's throw from the forks and the banks of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, that essentially the entire city of Winnipeg would be within range. So when installed on board, for the time, modern ships in the latter stages of World War II and in the early 1950s, these guns were controlled with power. So simply by turning a lever, left or right, the gun could be rotated left or right to bring it on target. And on the other side of the gun, could be rotated, the barrels could be raised or lowered. However, if your power's out, what do? And prior to the installation of powered mountings, it was all done by hand. So these cranks right here. So in this case, I'm sitting on the right or starboard side of the gun, and this is to train the gun left or right. On the other side of the gun, the port side, there's another crank just like this for going up or down. So as I mentioned in my introduction, this particular twin 4-inch gun would fire a 35-pound projectile. Now, 2 barrels, which means 2 projectiles, and again, loaded by hand. So as you can see, there's no auto-loading mechanism here. So sailors would have to take 35-pound projectiles, essentially a very, very large bullet, out of an ammunition locker, carry it to the gun, put it into the breech block here, and then close this breech block. So this entire piece right here slides down to open up to allow the shell to go in. Now, obviously, for safety reasons, we have it chained locked so that it isn't inadvertently opened, because that could cause a safety hazard. But in essence, this is a working gun. Other than the firing pins, everything needed is already here. So we've talked about the twin 4-inch quick-firing high-angle gun. As I mentioned, originally brought here to Chippawa in the early 1950s as a training piece, it is now simply an artifact. But given its restoration by World War II veterans as volunteers with the Naval Museum of Manitoba, it gives those of us, the sailors of today, a living connection to our history. Thanks for listening.
My name is Robert Watkins, and I am doing this video on behalf of Commander Chris Thane, a former commanding officer of HMCS Chippawa, who, unfortunately, is under the weather at this time and wished to have some input into the 100th anniversary celebrations of the Naval Division of HMCS Chippawa. Commander Thane joined the UNTDs in 1957 while attending St. John's College. He graduated with an arts degree and then went on to complete his university education at the University of Manitoba, where he obtained his bachelor's degree in education and then his master's degree. He joined the Naval Reserve Division at HMCS Chippawa after the completion of his UNTD training. In 1960, as an acting sub-lieutenant. In 1962, he was promoted to sub-lieutenant, and in 1964 to a lieutenant. In 1971, he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant commander, and a commander in 1973. He was appointed executive officer of HMCS Chippawa in 1977 and commanding officer in 1978. He terminated his appointment as commanding officer in 1981 and transferred to the sublist. Commander Thane qualified for the NCSO course in 1965, the Mars 4 NAV course in 1973, and received his watchkeeping certificate in 1977. During his tenure as commanding officer, he started the first Naval Museum at HMCS Chippawa. He recognized the need to catalog and display the many artifacts that had been donated to Chippawa. The first museum was located in the former Wren's Mess. After retirement from active duty, he volunteered for the museum and served on its board for a number of years. Chris had the pleasure of meeting His Highness Prince Philip when His Highness visited HMCS Chippawa to present medals to the cadets. Chris is a man of many talents. He has authored a book, Cold as a Bay Street Banker's Heart, that had 2 printed editions. He has also served as the president of the Naval Officers Association, Winnipeg branch. Commander Chris Thane is truly a sailor's sailor. Bravo, Zulu Chris. I'm not sure if it was the 50th anniversary of the reserve, and we met at Chippawa. Of course, he being an officer, I was only in the ranks at the time, but on the way out, I think, if I remember right, the Wrens had some input into this 50th anniversary of the reserves, and they had aboard their you probably recall them, where you have pictures of two wrens and there's no heads to it. So Chris and I were walking out on the parade square. He looked at me and I looked at him. He goes, pointed to it. So we got behind the board and had our picture taken. From then on, we were just friends, and then when we both got into the Naval Officers Association, I think we became closer, and we're still close. We're good buddies, very good buddies. Well, that was about the time that the Wrens had been absorbed into the reserves, and that's when the Wrens mess became vacant, and that's when Chris got the idea that, hey, we can utilize that for the museum. So that's how we started. Well, the artifacts had been donated by former veterans, if you will, and some of the veterans had passed away, and the families didn't know what to do with the items, so Chippawa was still there, so they thought, that's a good place. So that's how we got a lot of the stuff. And Harold Buchanan, he was, I believe, a lieutenant commander at the time. He was working with us to get the museum going, and he had a lot of good ideas. And eventually he passed away, but he left a good amount of money available for the museum. That's a long way back, but yeah. I did 3 years during the war, and then in reserves, after I got working and all that, I joined the reserves, and I did 12 years in reserves. And then I, like you, raising a family, I had to pack it in for a while. And then I got onto the museum board, and then with the Naval Officers Association. And of course, then I was also helping out with the Navy League of Canada. So I don't know how many years, I spent over 50 years with the Navy League of Canada, I know that. But my life has been Navy, but today I am bowing out and doing this for Chris thing. Have a Bravo Zulu for Chris. If it hadn't been for him, I would not have been able to get the Prairie Sailor up and running, if you might say. So I'm very grateful to him in many ways. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. You deserve all the accolades you can get. And a Bravo Zulu again.
I'm Commander Michael Kuehl, Commanding Officer, His Majesty's Canadian Ship Chippawa. HMCS Chippawa began service in 1923 as the Winnipeg Company. We continued service through the Second World War, where we commissioned as HMCS Chippawa in 1942. Today, HMCS Chippawa contributes its tradition of service, which also happens to be the ship's motto. Service through the Cold War and post-war period saw participation in Winnipeg floods and the Winnipeg polio outbreak. Today, Winnipeg sailors continue to contribute to the fabric of Manitoba and Canada. Our joint missions being support to the fleet and response to national emergencies. Winnipeg's citizen sailors serve throughout Canada and the world. Please join us in celebrating the 100th anniversary of His Majesty's Canadian Ship Chippawa and the Naval Reserve in Canada.